What is going on, everyone? So in this week's video, I want to talk about the key to being satisfied with our own work. In many ways, I believe the enemy is perfection. It's easy to fall into the trap of being a perfectionist. And I think many people consider themselves to be a perfectionist when it comes to photography, and they view it as a noble trait perhaps, but it really isn't a good thing. And the main thing is that perfection doesn't exist. So if you consider yourself a perfectionist, by very definition, you're never going to be satisfied with your own work. So I want to tell a story about a print I saw on display at the Museum of Photographic Arts here in San Diego. It's an Ansel Adams print, framed nicely on the wall. It's a desert scene, a dune in the foreground, some mountains in the background. And while viewing the print, it was kind of interesting to see. I can tell it was taken with a large format camera. I don't know if it was a 4x5 or an 8x10. But the reason I can tell was because there was some front tilt, which is where the lens kind of gets angled down a little bit, so the plane of focus kind of drops down, and it skimmed over the top of the foreground dune all the way to the mountains in the background, connecting them. But the area between where it dropped down on the backside of the dune, that was out of focus. And this was a strategic technical decision to try to make sure you get both the dune and the mountains in focus at the expense of the background. Because with that camera, with the particular settings he was working with, you really couldn't have it all in focus. You had to make those decisions. So some people might see this as a flaw or as a defect or an imperfection, not being able to get the entire scene in focus. But I found it very interesting. I found it very fascinating because it really made the photo feel so much more genuine, because it was a peek into the mind of setting up that photo, all the decisions that went into it. And this leads to a photo that I shot on my recent fall trip design. So it's this photo right here, which I call Resolute. And I've been really interested in learning the different plants of the places I go. So I learned this is a velvet ash tree. And there's a lot of them that grow throughout the park. It's actually the main tree you find in the campgrounds in Zion, but this one's grown in this little crack here. And I call this photo Resolute just because this stubborn tree is grown in this crack here. But since this is an ash tree, and since it's grown in a crack, an alternative title could be ash crack, but I went with Resolute. But this is a scene that was very difficult to photograph. I was using a long lens on my 8x10, a 600mm lens. Depth of field is really, really narrow. I was able to adjust the plane of focus so I can get a good chunk of that tree in focus, as well as some of this foreground wall, but I was not able to get all the tree in focus. And I could probably get the tree and the trunk and everything in focus, but then you'd have a really weird out of focus foreground and background. It just wouldn't look really natural. So even though I set this tree up against this nice dark stain right here, this part of the tree right here is not really in focus. This part right here is. That part of the trunk is in focus. This part of the trunk here is out of focus. It's just the limitations of working with the camera. And even though I wasn't able to get a very important part, which is this area of leaves here, set against a dark area in focus, I'm very satisfied with it. I mean, I had a 2-second exposure. I was working between the wind. I had to I opened up the aperture a little bit to get myself a little bit more ability to work with the scene. And I'm very satisfied with the results, despite it not being perfectly polished and perfect all the way around. By working with large format for the past little over a decade now, I've learned to accept the imperfections that come with it. And I found that that has been the key to being more satisfied with my own work. And this is something I really had struggled with, before going to film, where when you're working with a digital camera, you could, do the focus stacking and all kinds of different photos put together and kind of get this ultra polished photo. But I always found that kind of felt a little bit empty in a way. But in many ways, accepting the imperfections of large format and just doing the best that I can for that scene has led to a much greater sense of satisfaction. And if you think about, for example, maybe taking a portrait of someone, and then going in Photoshop and then airbrushing it, getting rid of any wrinkles, any scars, any sort of imperfections, and maybe while you're at it, maybe kind of adjust the eyes a little bit so they're a little bit more balanced. You can have this very highly perfected scene, but in the process of doing that, what you're going to do is you're going to strip away all those imperfections that make it genuine and that make it real. So one of the lessons I've learned by working with film and working within the limitations of film is to simply accept those imperfections And in many ways, I think it kind of becomes a bit of a strength to the image. Now, this doesn't mean that we should be sloppy with our work. We should strive to have excellent craftsmanship as photographers, and we should strive to constantly get better with that sense of craftsmanship. But in many ways, we should also perhaps be drawn to those imperfect subjects and those imperfect moments that might give a little bit more of a sense of genuineness to, those are words, right? Genuineness to the images, and perhaps lead to a greater sense of satisfaction with their work. But I'd be curious to hear your, I'm almost way through this and I start choking on myself. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And I want to thank everyone for watching. I'll see you around next time.